This morning is Acts chapter 20. We will be looking at verses 1 through 12. It concerns the third missionary journey of the Apostle Paul. Acts chapter 20. We'll be looking at verses 1 to 12. That's found on page 1123 in your Geneva Bible. Acts chapter 20, beginning at verse 1. Now after the tumult was appeased, Paul called the disciples unto him, and embraced them, and departed to go into Macedonia. And when he had gone through those parts, and exhorted them with many words, he came into Greece. And having tarried there 3 months, because the Jews laid wait for him, as he was about to sail into Syria, he purposed to return through Macedonia. And there accompanied him into Asia Sopater of Berea, and of them of Thessalonica Aristarchus and Secundus, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy, and of them of Asia Tychicus and Trophimus. These went before and tarried us at Troas. And we sailed forth from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and came unto them to Troas in 5 days, where we abode 7 days. And the first day of the week, the disciples being come together to break bread, Paul preached unto them, ready to depart on the morrow, and continue the preaching unto midnight. And there were many lights in an upper chamber, where they were gathered together. And there sat in a window a certain young man named Eutychus, fallen into a deep sleep. And as Paul was long preaching, he, overcome with sleep, fell down from the 3rd loft and was taken up dead. But Paul went down and laid himself upon him and embraced him, saying, Trouble not yourselves, for his life is in him. Then, when Paul was come up again, and had broken bread and eaten, having spoken a long while till the dawning of the day, he so departed. And they brought the boy alive, and they were not a little comforted. The text for this morning, Acts chapter 20, verses 1 to 10, the title of our message, The Third Missionary Journey. Of course, this is the third journey of the Apostle Paul. Our introduction. In this morning's text, Luke gives a very detailed account of Paul's travels in his third missionary journey. Today's text is predominantly a map study, and you have a large map bulletin insert to help you keep track of all the stops that we're going to look at this morning. It's easier to remember the journey, that is the third missionary journey, if we think of it as 21 stops. So far in this journey, Paul has made 4 stops, which include first Syrian Antioch, second Pisidia Antioch, third Phrygia, and fourth Ephesus. Ephesus was Paul's longest stay and where this morning's text begins. There are 2 points to our message this morning, verses 1 to 6, the travels of Paul and the brethren, and then verses 7 through 12, Paul raises Eutychus from the dead. And now our context. Also included in this text is the first mention of the early church's practice to worship on Sunday rather than Saturday, and the regular practice of celebrating the Lord's Supper. We come to our first point, verses 1 to 6, the travels of Paul and the brethren. Verse 1. Now after the tumult was appeased, Paul called the disciples unto him, and embraced them, and departed to go into Macedonia. The tumult here mentioned refers to the riot that took place in Ephesus, we looked at that last week, when Demetrius and his fellow silversmiths dragged Paul's companions into the theater at Ephesus. They had demanded immediate punishment against Paul and others who taught that there was only one living and true God. Paul had now come to the end of his stay in Ephesus. It was in Ephesus that Paul had written his first letter to the church at Corinth, 1 Corinthians. And within that book, chapter 16, verse 8, we read of his plans to remain in Ephesus until Pentecost, which we know to be 55 AD. It says in that text, "And I will tarry at Ephesus until Pentecost." But after the riot broke out, he changed his plans and remained in Ephesus a little while longer. Paul must have regarded the riot as an indication of providence for him to stay longer in Ephesus. Paul possibly refused to leave because it would appear that the uproar had its desired effect, to drive Christianity away. So he remained to show that Christianity should not be intimidated. When Paul does eventually leave Ephesus, he will leave Timothy behind to serve as their gospel minister. Verse 2, "And when he," that is Paul, "had gone through those parts, and had exhorted them with many words, he came into Greece." Those parts refer to Macedonia. According to 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 12 through 13, Paul took a ship from Ephesus, which is the fourth place on your map, to Troas. At Troas he had hoped to meet up with Titus, whom he had sent to Corinth, possibly to deliver his letter, 1 Corinthians, and to calm the troubles there at the church in Corinth. But Titus did not arrive as expected in Troas, so Paul left Troas and continued towards Macedonia, his fifth stop. We only label something a stop if he happened to do his ministry work there, not just being in the city. Titus had been delayed because he was trying to solve the problems in Corinth. Paul did not meet Titus in Corinth, but they did meet in Macedonia. Paul visited the churches of Philippi and Thessalonica while he was in Macedonia. Eventually, Titus did meet up with Paul in Macedonia and brought Paul great news of the resolved problems in Corinth. This brought Paul great joy, and his great relief is recorded in 2 Corinthians chapters 1 through 9. Paul's stay in Macedonia was very brief, but then he, and at least Titus, left for faraway Greece. That's the sixth of his 21st stop on his third missionary journey. Verse 3, "And having tarried there," that is Greece, 3 months, because the Jews laid wait for him, as he was about to sail into Syria, he purposed to return through Macedonia. Paul remained in Greece, we're told here, for 3 months because he learned of an assassination plot. These 3 months were probably the winter months of 56 to 57 AD. You might remember that Paul had previously been in Greece, especially in Athens, where he preached to the Athens Civil Council at Mars Hill. Only a few were converted at that time, but it seems now that the Spirit has gathered a considerable larger number of elect, so many that Paul needs to ask for help to minister in Greece. Paul and his companions may have been trying to establish a church in Athens, as there was already a church in Corinth. Toward the end of Paul's stay in Greece, a number of the delegates, that is, the delegates are those who had collected money from various regions as a collection for famine-starved Jerusalem, these delegates began to gather with Paul in Corinth, which is in Greece. The ships did not cross the Mediterranean until early spring, so they waited for the first ships who dared to make the first trip across the sea. Many of these ships were called pilgrim ships, which picked up Jews from various ports and brought them to Jerusalem to attend the year's Passover and the subsequent week after that, which is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Paul and the delegates were likely waiting for one of these ships so they could go to the Passover in Jerusalem. As Paul prepared to sail with certain delegates to bring their offering from Gentile churches to Jerusalem, he learned of an assassination plot. The Jews apparently had been so frustrated in disputing with Paul that they thought the best way to silence him was murder. Some think that the Jews laid wait for him to rob him of the money that he was carrying to Jerusalem for the relief of the poor saints there. But considering how very spiteful the Jews were against Paul, they probably thirsted for his blood more than for his money. Ironically, they want to kill Paul right before the Passover as they killed Christ right before the Passover, or at the Passover. We come to verses 4 and 5. And there accompanied Paul, into Asia, Sapater of Berea, and of them of Thessalonica, Aristarchus and Secundus, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy, and of them of Asia, Tychicus and Trophimus. These went before and tarried us at Troas. Here in this verse we have the names of the delegates and the regions that they represented. These were the men who made collections for Jerusalem and were commissioned to personally carry these funds to Jerusalem. Paul could not sail with them due to the plot against his life. The plot was apparently to assassinate him on the boat, but encouraged them to leave without him. He would meet up with them much later. The funds of the Jerusalem collection from the churches of Macedonia, we're told, were carried by Sopater of Berea, who's also mentioned in Romans 16:21, and Aristarchus and Secundus from Thessalonica. So they carried the gift from the two regions in Macedonia. The funds collected from Asia Minor were carried by Tychicus and Trophimus. And those of the region of Galatia were carried by Gaius from Derbe, and also Timothy, who was from Lystra in Galatia. No mention here is made of the collection from the church at Corinth, but they were probably had given their contribution to Titus in 2 Corinthians 6-23 and 12-18, when shows that he was there. Or maybe Luke carried it and did not desire to mention his own name in his own letter, which he often did. Verse 6, And we sailed from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and came unto them in Troas in 5 days, where we abode 7 days. The new plan was that Paul and Luke, notice the text changes to the word we, so Luke again is with Paul, would travel by foot back up north to Macedonia, you can see that on your map, and revisit the church in Philippi, which becomes his 8th stop. Shortly thereafter, they would sail across the sea, as you can see, and meet the other delegates in their 9th stop, Troas. We learn that Paul and Luke took 5 days to walk from Greece to Philippi, and then sailed across the sea to Troas, where they remained for 7 days. Paul would have missed going to the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread in Jerusalem. For Paul undoubtedly liked to go, even though those feasts were extinct. He liked to use that time to instruct a great many Jews that Christ had already come and was the fulfillment of the Passover lamb. Paul preached that Christ is our Passover and that Christian life is our Feast of Unleavened Bread. And now we come to our second point, verses 7 through 12. Paul raises Eutychus from the dead. And the first day of the week, the disciples being come together to break bread, Paul preached unto them, ready to depart on the morrow, and continued the preaching unto midnight. This is the earliest text in the New Testament that shows that the Christians regularly met for worship on the first day of the week. Sunday, which is called the Lord's Day in Revelation chapter 1, verse 10. Everything in the Old Testament, from the sacraments to the church offices and even the ordinances, take new shape in the New Covenant. And the day of worship is no different. The day of worship in the Old Testament was Saturday, the last day of the week, the day that God rested after having made all things in the space of 6 days. But a greater day has come, and that is Sunday, the day that Christ rose from the dead and redeemed all his elect. The narrative is written as an example for all the disciples of Christ to follow. The Lord's Day is a sign between Christ and his church, and is profaned when groups such as the Seventh-day Adventists, Jews, and Catholics worship on Saturday, or the Muslims when they worship on their so-called Holy Friday. There is significance to the Lord's Day being the first day of the week, being the resurrection of Christ, and therefore the first day of the week alone is to be set aside for worship. Furthermore, on the day of worship, we are to enter into his courts, Psalm 100. We are called to appear in His court for worship. And He has called us to His court on Sunday. And we ought not to fail to meet with Him at His appointed time, to give Him His worship that is due His name, to honor Him on the day that He has appointed to be the court day. Christ has promised His near presence on that day, and it is an appointment we must be eager to meet. We also notice that the disciples came together to break bread. The breaking of bread is a euphemism for partaking of the Lord's Supper. It is very possible that this phrase may have referred to a meal before the Lord's Supper, sometimes called a preparation meal or a love feast or a fellowship meal, none of which, by the way, are required in the Scriptures. But following that meal would always be the observance of the required Lord's Supper. Now, how do we know that this phrase, breaking of bread, refers to the Lord's Supper and not just a meal? Well, I'd like to give you 5 quick reasons. First, in the first place, the text would hardly mention the breaking of bread if it was just an ordinary meal. The phrase must refer to more than just a meal. Secondly, we notice that it is the disciples of Christ that are named to partake of the sacrament. For only believers, which are all disciples of Christ, might come to the supper. Thirdly, it was an occasion in which Paul preached. Preaching takes place on the Lord's Day and should always precede the Lord's Supper. Fourth, the sacrament was not observed until almost midnight. People do not generally gather just to eat meals at midnight. And 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 16, uses similar language to refer to the Lord's Supper. It says this, "The cup of blessing which we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ? The bread which we break, is it not the communion of the body of Christ?" So for those 5 reasons, I think we're talking about the Lord's Supper. The text also says that Paul preached unto them and continued the preaching until midnight. The reason that Paul preached until past midnight has nothing to do with him preaching an extraordinarily long sermon, as many long-winded preachers would like us to believe. This might have been a longer sermon because it was a farewell sermon. However, in this culture, work went very long into the evening, especially for slaves. Many slaves who might have become Christians. Meals were eaten in the early evening. So this meeting probably would not have started until 9 o'clock p.m. or even later. Paul preached and then prepared to administer the Lord's Supper. Now this sacrament already existed in the form of the Passover, but of course we know was altered by Christ at the Last Supper. The sacrament had changed from the Passover, which rescued Israel from the bondage of Egypt, to the Lord's Supper, which celebrated Christ rescuing the elect from the bondage of their sin. Paul likely needed a great deal of extra time to teach the sacrament, and there were probably a lot of questions and answers concerning this new rite. Therefore, as would be expected, the meeting probably lasted several hours. One final note concerning the Lord's Supper. It appears when reading the book of Acts that the supper was very frequent. This is not necessarily the case. Acts records the history of Paul. It follows Paul around, who went from home church to home church. Whenever Paul goes to a certain area, we read that he performs the Lord's Supper, to not only teach them of the new ordinance, but also because he was part of a very small group of ministers who could perform it. Rather than make the argument that the Lord's Supper was frequent from the book of Acts, the better argument is that it was infrequent, and that the early church was very careful that only a gospel minister should perform it. And since ministers were sparse at the time, it did not happen very often. Verse 8, "And there were many lights in an upper chamber, where they were gathered together. We have here an account of what happened in Troas, which was Paul's ninth stop on his third missionary journey. Specifically, what happened on the last of the 7 days that Paul stayed there. It was the early days of the church. The church had no temple or synagogue or stately chapel or cathedral. They had only the upper rooms, which were the top floor of a person's house, and this is where the Christians worshipped. Luke takes special pains to mention that many lights were lit throughout the house. This might be for at least two reasons. The first being that Paul would want them to look up passages in the Scripture to confirm the truth of what he said. So light was needed to read the Scriptures. Second reason might be is that the authorities were also very suspicious of the Christians and their meetings. So lighting them well allowed people to see clearly what they were doing, for the Christians were often accused of doing evil in their late night meetings. Verse 9, "And there sat in a window a certain young man named Eutychus, fallen into a dead sleep. And as Paul was long preaching, he, overcome with sleep, fell down from the third loft and was taken up dead." The name Eutychus means fortunate one of God. This young man may have been the child of parents who desired to hear Paul, or he might have been a young convert, or he might have even been a slave. The fact that he was overcome with sleep, and it's specifically mentioned that way in the Greek, means that he fought against falling asleep. But in the end, the evening was very late, and far past the time he was usually asleep. And he was a slave. He also worked very long hours. He may have sat by the window to stay awake, but through no fault of his own, we're told that he fell asleep. The child fell out of the third-story window and was immediately presumed dead. While many take this as the chastisement of God for being inattentive at worship, the circumstances, it being midnight, hardly makes a strong case for this being God's wrath. Verse 10, "But Paul went down and laid himself upon him and embraced him, saying, 'Trouble not yourself, for his life is in him.'" We learn that Paul immediately descended the stairs and brought the young child back to life. The purpose of this narrative is consistent with other narratives in Acts, in which the gospel is often accompanied by extraordinary miracles to confirm its authenticity. In this case, all those in the upper room had been listening to the words of Paul late into the night. And now, shortly after midnight, his words are given greater weight and miraculously confirmed by the witness of raising the child from the dead. The matter of the miracle is of some interest, for the text says that Paul laid himself upon him. This is similar to the manner in which both Elijah and Elisha each raised a young child from the dead. In 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 21, Elijah is said to have stretched himself upon the child 3 times and called unto the Lord. And similarly, Elisha in 2 Kings 4:34 is said to have lay upon the child and put his mouth on his mouth and his eyes upon his eyes and his hands upon his hands and stretched himself upon him, and the flesh of the child waxed warm. Paul may have been instructed to do the same thing by the same Spirit that instructed the prophets Elijah and Elisha to perform the same task of bringing the child back to life. The Spirit certainly assured Paul that his actions would result in bringing the child back to life. Otherwise, Paul wouldn't have said that the child was going to come back to life. Finally, in verses 11 and 12, "Then when Paul was come up again and had broken bread and eaten, having spoken a long while till the dawning of the day, he so departed, and they brought the boy alive, and they were not a little comforted." Paul immediately returned to his work after this interruption. While the life of the boy certainly warranted attention, the souls of the elect were still in great need that Paul continue his preaching and instruction concerning the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. After the worship service and sacrament, the people stayed and spoke with Paul until the dawning of the next day. They regarded a night of such accelerated learning was worth the loss of one night's sleep. The young child apparently took some time to recover from his fall. Perhaps he had broken bones or cuts that needed to be mended. But hours later, they brought the boy back into the congregation. This was the cause of great rejoicing, because God had chosen to show them a personal, unique miracle which contributed to the credit and effect of the gospel preached by Paul.